Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining Backyard Birds. My name is Lindsay McNamara. I'm so excited to be presenting for you all today. Um, we are going to go ahead and get started. So before we talk about the birds that you can see throughout your backyard and maybe in your neighborhood or wherever it is that you happen to live, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about me. Um, I graduated from the University of Delaware a few years ago with a degree in environmental studies. I have a master's degree from Montclair State University in public and organizational relations. And I've been a bird nerd forever. I started birding when I was 9. My spark bird is a great blue heron. I saw my first great blue heron along the Raritan when I was on a trip with my family in the car. The big bird was just standing on a rock in the middle of the South Branch, and I was hooked. And so since then, I've been involved in a number of different New Jersey organizations, including Conserve Wildlife Foundation of New Jersey, and have really involved growing and learning more about birds every day. And so I highly encourage you to get involved or check out any of the organizations that you see here listed on the screen. And I also wanted to make a special plug for Hog Island Audubon Camp, which is up in Maine. Now that we're all able to hopefully travel safely again soon, or in the coming months, I would highly recommend checking that out up in Maine. You get to go for a whole week and learn from world-class instructors. And so currently, when I'm not giving presentations about birds or going out birding myself, I am a development officer at American Bird Conservancy, and so I fundraise for birds as well. And so let's jump right in and talk about some of our favorite backyard birds. Okay, so you saw our American robin on the title slide. Here's another one. I just love this picture. All of these photos are my own. You'll have to excuse, I'm a little bit of an amateur photographer, but it's been really fun and a great way to immerse myself in the birds that I love even more. It's just a different level of study when you go out with your camera, or as you know, if you're an artist and you like to draw, if you make any field drawings, or even if you take notes or do audio recordings. I think for a lot of us, it's just so much fun to kind of deepen that level of interaction that we have with the birds and that level of study. And so even if you're watching your backyard birds from your feeder, from the comfort of your own home, maybe your porch or your kitchen or a chair in your house, it might be really fun to start to keep a yard list, keep track of the birds that you see every day if you haven't already. See if you can maybe distinguish between individuals of different species within the visitors that are coming to your home, or any other aspects of kind of nature watching that suit you. And so while we get very excited, especially during spring migration, about hermit thrushes and wood thrushes, Swainson's thrushes, it's important to note that American robins are thrushes too. And so we really shouldn't take for granted just how beautiful these birds are. While a lot of them are one of those first signs of spring, especially for us here in New Jersey, it's important to note that we do have resident populations throughout the state too. So you can actually see robins in the winter, but certainly they are much more plentiful, and maybe they're more numerous in your backyard too in the springtime. And here we have, this is a little cell phone pic, but I just found myself, I was walking on actually the streets of Morristown up in North Jersey and came across a mourning dove that had made a nest, and you can see her baby right here, her chick. And so this was delightful. A lot of folks may mistake mourning doves, that cooing sound that they make, coo, 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 for an owl. It's a birder's rite of passage to think that when you're hearing a mourning dove early in the morning, that maybe you have an owl. We've all done it. We've all been there. So don't worry too much, but typically it might be a mourning dove. What's fun too is that they're pretty loud when they fly away. And that sound isn't actually a vocalization. It's the sound of the wind moving through their wings. And so here we have, this is a common raven. you can see that it has that kind of honking bill there. And these birds, these corvids, not to be confused with COVID, but these corvids are really expanding in their range, perhaps due to climate change and other factors, but they're really pushing more north. So it used to be more difficult to see common ravens throughout New Jersey, but now we see and hear them more often. You can hear their elaborate croaks and other vocalizations. They're very loud. So if you look for common ravens throughout your backyard or your neighborhood, even off your balcony or patio, they're big. They're pretty big. They're about the same size as a red-tailed hawk. And they also have a fan-shaped tail too. So if you look out for size, which I know sometimes is hard to do if there isn't something flying relative to the bird that you're looking to identify, you can look for that fan-shaped tail and see if that can't help you distinguish from a raven from a crow. We also have a lot of fish crows throughout New Jersey, and so they're a little bit smaller and slightly more iridescent blue than American crows, but it's pretty hard to tell. Fish crows are also pretty likely to be hanging out on telephone poles, and you can listen. One of my favorite birder jokes is you can ask a crow if you're not sure if it's an American crow or a fish crow, because one of the only ways that you can really distinguish between the two for sure is through their vocalizations. And so if you ask the crow, are you an American crow? And it says, then you know that you have a fish crow, because fish crows make more of these noises as opposed to the American crow, that iconic caw caw that we know. And so you just ask those crows their question and then see what happens. Our next bird here is a dark-eyed junco. I took this photo at my parents' house in my parents' backyard. I like it because it looks like a little heart shape on its chest. So we love these snowbirds, right? These sparrows come through and they're kind of one of those transition birds that bring with them a new season. And so we know in the late summer and early fall, when the juncos start to come back, that winter is on the horizon. And these beautiful birds will likely spend a lot of time in your yard in the winter time. They're one of the most common birds across the United States, especially because there's 5 different subspecies of juncos. You can see the coloration is a little bit different if you look at field guides across the Western US, but it doesn't make them any less beautiful. And so I would definitely keep an eye out. I've seen 1 or 2 still sticking around, but in a couple of months, they'll be back in full force. And here's a favorite. So blue jays are quite vocal too. They're also in the corvid family. So even though they are not all black like our ravens and crows, blue jays belong to that same very smart family of corvids. What's really interesting too is that blue in birds is not possible to make in nature. It's not found in nature. So when you see a blue bird, it's structurally blue. It's not pigmented blue. And what this means is that the way the light is hitting how the cells and the feathers are constructed and made up, it appears blue. And so if you happen to watch a blue jay in flight and the color, the light changes, you might notice that the appearance of blue in their feathers might shift. If you happen to be at an environmental education center and you're looking at different feathers, if you hold up a blue jay feather into the light versus other areas, you might notice that it gets darker when it's away from the light, which is really interesting. And so again, blue jays are structurally blue. They're not pigmented blue. So you can save that for your next safe outdoor dinner party. What's fun about blue jays too is that they're also known to mimic raptors. And so I've heard them make the vocalizations of red-tailed hawks. I've heard them do red-shouldered hawks too. No one's quite sure exactly why this happens. It might be because they're looking to push other birds out of the area so there's more food for them. They might be maybe attempting to make sure that they themselves don't become prey by looking to maybe make the appearance that another hawk is in the area so more hawks don't come through. There's all sorts of speculation on why this happens, but it's fascinating nonetheless. And the next time that you think that you hear a red-tailed hawk, I would encourage you to always, always take another look, because it might be one of the blue jays in your yard. Here we have a white-breasted nuthatch. We have two nuthatches in New Jersey. You might also see red-breasted nuthatches as well. And so you'll see this is kind of that typical nuthatch pose where they work up and down the trunk of different trees, and they pose upside down, which is so much fun. I just really enjoy watching these birds. They're just so full of personality. And what's interesting too is that some other birds, when they work up and down the trunk like this, they're using their tail kind of as a propeller, as a prop, and nuthatches don't actually do that. They're able to move up and down the tree solely based on the strength of their little feet, which I think is pretty amazing. And here we have, hopefully you all have heard northern mockingbirds. So these are those mimics like brown thrashers that are throughout the state that are able to mimic car alarms and human voices. They're just one of those birds that's really kind of adapted to our human built environment. And you'll hear them throughout the day in different sequences. They'll also, since they're mimics, what's so fun is that if you're new to a birding spot, or if you're not sure the birds that are in your backyard, if you listen to a mockingbird rapid fire 4 or 5 different species, they usually repeat the calls maybe 2 or 3 times, you'll get a feel for what other birds are in the area without having to go too far. I was recently visiting Sandy Hook and I heard a mockingbird, and it started on its its repertoire, and that repertoire included eastern towhee. There was some phoebe in there, and there was some yellowlegs in there, which makes sense because those are all other birds that you can find along Sandy Hook, some wrens too. But that mockingbird told me who else to expect and who else to look for, which is one of my favorite things about these birds. What's really interesting too is that they don't just sing during the day. These are mockingbirds are one of the species of birds that will actually sing at night too, especially if there's a full moon. So, I know that we see them often, but trying to make sure that we give appreciation where appreciation is due, even for common birds. Here is our state bird, the beloved American goldfinch. And so certainly this male is in his summer clothes. His plumage is very, very bright yellow and bright black. In the winter time, I'm sure you all have seen in your backyard, maybe at your feeders, if you have them, that they molt into kind of this olive green. And so they're one of the few finches that will molt multiple times a year. But American goldfinches are wonderful. They're one of the first bird calls that I learned. They say what sounds like to me, potato chip, potato chip, potato chip, as they fly in that undulating pattern across the sky, especially in the summertime. And American goldfinches are one of the songbirds. They're actually kind of late to nest, so they wait for the seeds of fibrous plants, and they use those seeds to both line their nests and also feed their young. And so goldfinches don't really start nesting in New Jersey until June or July. So as things kind of settle down in terms of spring migration, maybe it isn't as birdy as it usually is near you. You can always count on the goldfinches to put on a show. And here we have kind of an artsy photo that I had fun taking of a white-throated sparrow. And so these birds are kind of like dark-eyed juncos, to me at least, really signal a transition in seasons. And so they'll come, they're here now, they're singing now, they'll leave, and then they'll come back kind of at the beginning of fall in the winter time. And you can listen for their calls, "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada," or "Oh, Sam, Peabody, Peabody, Peabody," throughout your backyards. You'll notice that this bird in particular, there's 2 different types of morphs of white-throated sparrow, and this one is the white morph. It has very, very distinct yellow, very bright white. There's also tan morphs throughout the state that their colors on their face are a little bit more muted. So it's always a good idea to triple check. You want to make sure you're looking at every bird because there are some variances between species, which is super fascinating. And here we have a house finch, another finch. And this male here with the red, what's interesting too, kind of we were talking about blue jays and their structural blue. Red is another color that needs to come from somewhere. And so the pigment in house finches, it depends on the food sources that house finches eat. And so it has to do too, this plays a role in sexual selection a little bit as well for the female house finches. And what we've seen is that the red of the male house finches comes from pigments within their food during molt, since birds can't make bright red or yellow colors directly. And so the more pigment in their food, the redder the male. And then the females prefer to mate with the reddest male that they see, maybe to increase their chances of finding a mate who can do his part to feed their nestlings, right? So if he's really bright red, he seems to be good at finding food, and the female is hopeful that he will do the same for their offspring. So I had mentioned my spark bird. I would be remiss to not add the great blue heron here to our discussion of backyard birds throughout New Jersey. Now, I don't anticipate that many of you will have a great blue heron land in the lawn or the native plants of your backyard. If they do, that's amazing, and that certainly is worth a picture. Certainly more possible if you have any sort of water feature on your property or where you live. But I wanted to include them because we often see them flying over here in New Jersey on their way from water body to water body. And they really look to me just like such a dinosaur, just like a pterodactyl as they're flying over with their neck tucked in and their big long wings and their feet. So this I wanted to include because it's important to look up, not just out directly at our backyard in the trees or our bird feeders, but also look up to the sky and see who might be flying over. What's fascinating too about great blue herons is that as big as these and tall as these birds look to be, they only weigh about 5 or 6 pounds because their bones are hollow, which I think is pretty incredible. And here we have one of the tried and true backyard favorites, our northern cardinal. This is a brilliant red male. Kind of the same idea here as the male house finch. So that brilliant red is going to depend on the types of food that this male will eat. Cardinals also, there's been some research that's been done around the relationship between the pigment in birds and native plants versus invasive plants, right? And so if cardinals are eating invasive berries, they may not become as bright as if they were eating native berries, and that could potentially play a role in sexual selection and mate choices too. And so I'm sure that you've heard cardinals before. They have that very iconic cheer, cheer, cheer throughout your backyard, and often placed in movies. I don't know about you, but now that I'm such a full-blown bird nerd, it's fun for me to try to identify bird songs in the background of certain movies, depending on the sense of place that those directors are trying to go for. And so I've been on the lookout and have heard northern cardinals recently in a lot of movies. And so kind of like the house finches too, when northern cardinals go to pair up, the female, the male goes out to look for food and he feeds her. And if she likes the way that he feeds her, she kind of snuggles up underneath him, and then they go about the rest of their business in making more northern cardinals. So we never tire of these, certainly. We're lucky to have them out here too. Out west, folks, we're a little spoiled. There aren't as many northern cardinals. Their range is much more eastern. And so this is a bird that we're definitely lucky to see every day. And so here we have a black-capped chickadee. We have two different types of chickadees typically, and most commonly here in New Jersey. We have the black-capped and we also have Carolina chickadees in the southern part of New Jersey. And chickadees in general are really, really smart. They're kind of redefining this negative stereotype around a quote unquote bird brain. Birds are extremely smart. Chickadees are able to, they sort of have memory in a way. They can kind of remember where they cache food. They also will hang out in big intraspecies flocks during the winter, for everyone to kind of be more on the lookout for food sources. You'll see them run with tufted titmice, maybe some nuthatches as well. They'll kind of all be together as they look for food together. And chickadees are one of those birds, right, that they do not necessarily migrate. And so they need to adapt to be able to handle the cold weather if they're not looking to travel in other places once that happens. And so chickadees, like humans, will actually shiver to regulate their body temperature, which is, I think, really interesting. And they also are able to go into kind of like a torpor, like a hummingbird, where at night they essentially go into almost like a hibernation, and they're able to drop their metabolic rate so low to be able to survive that cold temperature, and then wake themselves up in the morning and carry on with their chickadee business. And so there's a really fascinating chapter all about chickadees in Jennifer Ackerman's book, The Genius of Birds. And so I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about chickadees, to check that book out. And here we have, I love vultures. So they're one of my favorite species. I think that they're very misunderstood and that we should all appreciate them for who they are, which is, as scavengers, they're helping to really clean up our ecosystems and make sure they're safe from diseases and other issues. They have really interesting adaptations to be able to make sure that they're able to keep their feet clean from different bacteria and other issues when it comes to eating carrion. And so they are very resourceful. And this is the turkey vulture here with the red face. And then here's the black vulture here with the gray face. Black vultures also, this is a nice little portrait from State Line Lookout, but black vultures also have gray feet. And then they have, when they fly, their wingspan is a little bit shorter than a turkey vulture. And they have those really beautiful, like white fingertips, quote unquote, while they're flying, that can help you tell the difference between black vultures and turkey vultures here in New Jersey. Black vultures are another species that their range is really expanding northward. And so we're seeing them more and more throughout the entire state. And turkey vultures are, they have an excellent sense of smell, and they will actually help lead black vultures to different food sources. And when you see a kettle of vultures, as it's called, when you see a group of vultures kind of circling all together in the air, a lot of folks kind of make this assumption that, you know, it's very ominous, right? Oh, something must be dead. Look at them all circling in the air. It's not true. What they're doing actually is they're riding the thermals of the air. And so they're just, what they do is they kind of they circle up upward using those thermals towards the sky, and then they kind of like end up coasting down a little bit, and they have to pick back up, and then they go back up a little bit higher, and they come back down, and so they're just kind of making this pattern of making it easier for them to get to where they're going by riding those thermals instead of using a lot of their energy. So it's a really interesting and sophisticated way of getting to where they need to go, and it has really nothing to do with if there's anything dead in the area. So there are sanctuaries like Hawk Mountain that celebrate vulture appreciation. And there are a lot of groups that are looking to kind of change the narrative around these two birds. And so I'm hopeful that maybe you will too. And here we have, who doesn't love an owl, right? So there are a number of owl species throughout New Jersey that are possible in your backyard. One of them being a great horned owl here. They tend to like fairly suburban areas. They're a little bit more tolerant than other species. And so it's always a good idea to maybe get outside to a forest near where you live and see if you can't get a look at a great horned owl. Those corvids that we talked about earlier too, like blue jays and crows, they will often mob an owl. So there'll be a group of them that will kind of gang up on an owl and they'll make a lot of noise and they'll try to get it to kind of flee the area. And so they might bop him on the head a little bit or just generally bother the raptor, right? And so if you're on the lookout for owls, remember those corvids. If you hear a big rackus and you see a big coop of them, it's definitely worth another look because you never know if they might be mobbing an owl or not. And that's actually how I was able to take this photo, is that the crows led me to this bird, which was pretty exciting. Here we have woodpeckers, right? We have so many different woodpeckers here in New Jersey. On the left side is a beautiful northern flicker. I have a hard time finding a bird more beautiful than a flicker between its polka dots, the red heart-shaped that's on the back of its head, just a beautiful pattern on its feathers. I just really, really love northern flickers. And so you can see here, this is a male. This is the whisker. This black whisker here underneath the bill will actually is an indicator that this is a male northern flicker. And we have yellow shafted flickers here in New Jersey. So if this bird were to get up off here and fly away, you'd see the yellow within the shafts of its feathers. Out west, they're actually red shafted northern flickers. So that's on my list to see if I can't get out west as everything gets safer and see a red shafted northern flicker. And here we have a red-bellied woodpecker. They're pretty common throughout New Jersey. They're another bird that has really expanded their range recently. I'm not sure if any of you have seen the 3 Billion Birds report that came out maybe a year or so ago now, 2 years ago now, from Cornell Lab of Ornithology and others about which kind of groups of birds are not doing so great and then what groups of birds are expanding among this 3 billion bird loss since 1970. And woodpeckers are one of the groups that are actually doing a little bit better. And so these red-bellied woodpeckers are becoming more and more common in backyards and at feeders, especially, of course, suet feeders. And here we have another potentially misunderstood bird, a brown-headed cowbird. This is a male. You may or may not see these birds in your backyard, especially in the springtime. They have a kind of iconic call. It's a little high pitch that you can listen for, especially this time of year. And so they tend to, yes, sometimes visit folks' feeders, and they have a little bit of a bad rap because they're brood parasites. And so what that means is that brown-headed cowbirds don't make their own nest. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests and kind of push out the species that was in that nest to start with. And so this has been a problem for some of our native birds. I actually saw a common yellowthroat feeding a young brown-headed cowbird at one of the parks that we have here in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, because the parent birds, will feed anything that's in their nest, right? And so it's kind of an amazing adaptation that brown-headed cowbirds are able to do this. So they just kind of drop off their young and keep going, but it made sense because they used to be fairly limited, their range out west of these big kind of grassland areas, and they would follow the buffalo and these other big mammals. And so because of their kind of nomadic nature, historically, they weren't really able to be tied down and be making their own nest. Now, as humans have kind of really changed the landscape over the last several decades of what the United States looked like, we've expanded the brown-headed cowbird's preferred habitat. And so this bird has expanded with that habitat change and then has become a bit of a threat to native species, but it isn't the bird's fault that it's evolved the way that it has. And so it's just something to keep in mind the next time that you see a brown-headed cowbird in your backyard. And since we were talking about woodpeckers before, here's two that I'm sure many of you have seen. Here's a downy woodpecker, so a little bit smaller, shorter bill, and then that's a male. See, the red on its head is a male. Here's a female hairy woodpecker. She has a bit of a bigger bill, and so it's a little morbid, but one of the ways that I remember how to tell the difference between a hairy woodpecker and a downy woodpecker is that, hypothetically speaking, because we are all bird lovers here, if the bill is long enough that you are able to kind of almost visualize pushing it in to the head of the bird, and the size of the bill would be as long as the head is, then you have a hairy woodpecker, right? It's just a much, much bigger bill. It's about the same length as the head, versus a downy woodpecker is a much smaller bill. And so we look for these birds in our backyards throughout the year in different forests, and also downy woodpeckers even like to forage within phragmites. And so you might see them in marshy and kind of wetlands coastal habitat as well, which is interesting. And that was a pleasant surprise when I had taken this photo. And so another owl, of course, is the eastern screech owl. This is a red morph eastern screech owl. We also have gray morph eastern screech owls here in New Jersey. And so I actually was able to listen in my old apartment complex where I lived in Bloomfield. I was awoken one morning at like 5 in the morning and actually heard an eastern screech owl in Bloomfield, New Jersey. I was so excited. And so I got up really quickly and ran to my window, and my cat was very excited. She didn't really know what was going on, and was able to grab some audio of this eastern screech owl so that I was able to upload it to eBird so that we could be sure that this eastern screech owl was counted out in Bloomfield. And so they're known for their whinny of the woods, which I'll play now. This is the recording that you can hear cars a little bit. Sorry about that. And my cat is purring. It's a very real recording. But you can hear that whinny. And that's why these owls are sometimes referred to as the whinny of the woods, which is so fun. So you can look out for these small owl species, and also listen for that whinny of the woods in your backyard or your neighborhood or your local patch, and see if those are near you too. And one of our tried and true, here's a red-tailed hawk. You can see what makes this hawk a red-tailed hawk. See the belly band here. And then we can't see its red tail, the top of its red tail, but we would obviously be looking for that red tail. But red-tailed hawks, that red tail comes after about a year or so of maturity. So you don't only want to rely on the red of the tail to make your ID. The belly band will also help you. And there's usually a V shape of white feathers on their back that might also help you to identify red-tailed hawks. These birds are really common in New Jersey. They're beautiful. Just because they're common doesn't make it any less stunning every time that you see one. They like edge habitat quite a bit to be able to hunt for different rodents and other prey items. We certainly like to make a lot of edge habitat here in New Jersey with different subdivisions coming up against forests or different neighborhoods throughout suburbia, different parks and things of that nature. So this species is certainly doing well. They're also common across the continent, and you can find them in any sort of habitat that we have, from the suburbs of New Jersey to the rainforests of Mexico. They're an extremely generalist species with all different types of morphs, to the darker ones and the lighter ones, to be able to adapt to these different habitats, which is super fascinating. And here's one of my favorites, a Carolina wren. We have other wrens throughout New Jersey too that you could maybe see or hear in your backyard, especially house wrens this time of year too. And marsh wrens if you're near a marshy area, if you happen to visit a marshy area. But here's our tried and true Carolina wren. Tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle is what he is saying here. There are a number of other vocalizations that they make too. They also kind of trill. And so very iconic species here in New Jersey, super beautiful. And I think my friends and I would like to start a petition to have the Carolina wren actually be the New Jersey state bird, because they are just so loud and feisty. And we think that that makes sense for us. And so it's incredible the ratio of sound that these wrens are able to make proportionate to their body. You can just hear them at anywhere, at any point in the forest or the habitat that you're at, and they may visit your backyard as well. And finally, there were a couple of other hawks that I wanted to talk about, and falcons too. So here's an adult Cooper's hawk, and this is a Cooper's hawk too, and this is a small falcon called a merlin. A lot of these birds are also expanding, and we're finding more and more Coopers and the smaller but similar looking sharp-shinned hawks that they look just like Cooper's hawks, but they're about the size of a blue jay, so they're much smaller. So Coopers and Sharpies are really expanding into suburban areas in not only New Jersey, but kind of throughout the country, in part because folks do have bird feeders out. And so be mindful that when you're deciding to feed the birds, you may be feeding all different types of birds, and that's the nature of the food chain. And I certainly would be very excited to have hawks in my yard, and these small falcons known as merlins that are throughout New Jersey can also be seen in more suburban areas than they have been before. So I would look out for these folks as well. And especially now that it's spring migration, you might have a ton of other interesting visitors to your backyard, which include maybe rose-breasted grosbeaks, orioles, the catbirds are back, all the warblers are coming through. Maybe you're hearing those yellow warblers saying, "Sweet, sweet, sweet, I'm so sweet." The wheezy, wheezy, wheezy of black and white warblers, and the witchetty, witchetty, witchetty of common yellowthroats too, depending on where you are. All of these birds are making their way up to their breeding grounds and are, just taking over New Jersey in the best way possible. So I would certainly be on the lookout for other species of birds in your backyard. Keep your eyes and ears open. And if you have any questions about any of the birds that we've talked about, please feel free to ask a bird nerd, and you can reach me via email or on Instagram. And thank you so much. Happy birding and happy spring migration.